the reason I think people focus on recruiting is because they can say we have 5 Black people in our department, or we have this many trans students. Like, if you, that's like data that they can report outwardly. So to say I'm doing something.
Welcome to the friend zone, the only friend zone with a solution to get out of it. Today we have a guest who I met at UNC Chapel Hill, but now she's across the country in California pursuing her Ph.D. in chemistry. She hails at the University of California, Berkeley, so you can tell she's pretty smart, but I'm not going to give away too much about her. Without further ado, I want to welcome Kristen Gardner to the Friend Zone.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Well, I'm excited to have you too. Hopefully the viewers are too. But let's just get started, talking a little bit about where you grew up and a little bit also about your family background.
Yeah. So I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where I say I'm from. I was technically born in New York, but I've spent most of my life in North Carolina. And I'm the oldest of 3. So my, you know, we're 1 year apart, so we're very close. We're all in college at the same time. Probably a little bit chaotic for my family. And then I'm a first generation American. My mom was born in the Bahamas, and her mom was born in England. So my mom is half Bahamian, half English, and she's also white. And then my dad is from Jamaica, but he moved to the U.S. when he was 7. And so I grew up with 2 parents who were born in different countries. And I think that definitely has shaped who I am today. But I think that really pushed me to get to where I am today. And I also think that, my time in North Carolina my time growing up was very much shaped by my background.
Okay. I actually never knew you lived in the north. I'm also, prior resident of the north before moving to North Carolina.
Yeah.
What age again did you move to North Carolina?
So we moved for my dad's job. So he just got a job in North Carolina, so that's why we moved there, and we stayed there until I basically finished college. So
Okay. Sorry, I was actually asking what age did you move to North Carolina?
My bad. I was 8.
8 years old. Okay. I thought that's what I heard. So maybe that's why we don't hear much of that southern twang to your accent. I feel like I don't have it either. I mean, growing up in the north, also living in, Ghana for a few years, I think that influenced my current accent. It's a mixture of a little bit of everything. But you mentioned something very interesting that probably a lot of people looking at you, they can probably tell you're mixed, but couldn't pinpoint that you're Caribbean on both sides and that your mother is also from the Caribbean. How was that having, a white mother and a Black father, both being from the islands?
I think so. It's interesting because my mom is white and she's from a majority Black country. So in my mom's eyes, she was a minority growing up. And obviously, like, it's not anywhere near the same as growing up Black in America. And I think that kind of, influenced. I think she wanted us to grow up being not really thinking about race. She wanted us to be successful. And I think when she thinks about it, she likes to refer back to, like, I was a minority where I'm from, even though it's not the same at all, right? And so I think one thing is, because I had a white mother and a Black father, who really they didn't really, growing up, they were like, success is based on just how hard you work. Anyone can be successful. And I think I went through high school till wasn't until I got to high school where I was really like, there are these huge disparities, because I think up until that point, the biggest thing that I noticed was that people would say, oh, you don't look like your mom, right? Like, we might be on the street, people would ask if I was adopted. I remember one time I went to the nail salon, and the person doing my nails asked if I was my mom's neighbor. Like, the idea of us being related didn't cross anyone's mind. And so I think that was the only really time I thought about my race growing up, just because I think my parents were really focused on merit. And it wasn't until I got to high school where, you know, people would start to say, you only got accepted to UNC because of your race, or like it's going to be easier for you. Like it's not fair that you get these opportunities because you're black, especially because people will be like you're black but you don't act black. And I think that was actually where I started to kind of think more about my race regularly, if that makes sense. And especially, of course, that was being a black woman in chemistry. I very much noticed that as I got through college, but that also created some not tension, but lack of understanding from my mom, right? Because she thought that, oh, your skin color doesn't matter, like, and it was a very touchy subject to her, just because she she would get asked if she was the nanny or if the kids were adopted a lot of the times because we didn't look the same. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is it was an interesting dynamic in the sense that it wasn't until I really got older that I started to kind of think more about the color of my skin, just because that was just the way my parents, I think they tried to shelter us like a lot when you can't actually do that. Um, but yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question, but that's kind of when I think about my childhood and growing up, it's very much like we didn't think about it. The only time I really thought about the color of my skin was when it was pointed out, and I guess I was lucky in that way. But it was a big reality check when I came to college, and I'd be the only black woman in my chemistry classes, and then my mom would be like, "I don't care, like why you care so much about this. This doesn't matter." Um, when in reality, it has a big it affects my experiences in chemistry. And I think it took her a long time to also accept that.
Yeah. In what ways do you feel like it's affected your experience in chemistry that your mother doesn't see it?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's it's very isolating. Often I'm the only black woman in the room. I'm the only my chemistry department is over 400 people and there's maybe four black women, and I'm the only one in synthesis at Berkeley. And so I think my mom doesn't understand how isolating that is and how you're expected to do so much, like it's expected of you to be better, to be seen as equal to other people. And I think for her, an example I can give is when I was picking graduate schools, I would like go onto the websites of different labs and look at the diversity of the groups. And it was really sad to me to see that there were so few black people in general and very little black women. And my mom didn't understand why I cared about that. And for me, it's like representation or seeing other people that look like me that was important, that I don't think she really understood. And I think it's just because, you know, she's not, once again, like, yeah, she was a minority in her home country, but it was, it's just not it's not the same. And it's not as isolating. She ended up going to boarding school in England and she came to the US, right? She's not a minority anymore. And she's also a white woman with lots of privileges. And I think she didn't understand that people look at me and know I'm black. I think that's the other thing, right? Like she gets very offended if I call myself a black woman and not a biracial woman because to her, right, like I need to include that whiteness. Even though if someone looks at me, they might assume I'm mixed, but they're still going to say I'm a black woman. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And going back to the minority aspect from her viewpoint, growing up in the Bahamas, would you say that race? A lot of people here in the U.S. say race is a social construct. It's something that we've created to tag onto people here. But do you feel like, from your experience visiting the Bahamas, that race is a big of a factor in in the Bahamas or in the Caribbean islands, or just outside the U.S. in general?
So I think in the Bahamas, it's not as big of a thing. Um, it's it's funny, we were just talking about this last week because I had the opportunity to be there, but it's like in the Bahamas, people obviously notice the color of your skin, but it's not as big of a deal, right? Like, I think if um, you're a black woman who's successful, that's, I mean, they're not expecting you not to be, right? The majority of the country is black. Also, like, my mom is always like, oh, if you see a mixed kid on the street in the Bahamas, there's no question like that if they're walking with a white person, that's not their parent. Versus like in the US, color is something that is noticed all the time, even if people pretend like it's not. Like, there's no way to avoid it. um and I think, so yeah, I guess from my perspective, which I can also only speak on the Bahamas just because I've only been to Jamaica one time, is that it's still a thing, still a problem. Racism is still a problem. Racism is a problem everywhere, but it doesn't seem to be as extreme in the Bahamas.
Fair
But
enough.
I'll also say, like, you know, the white people there tend to be more privileged, right? Like, they might be minorities, but they still have that level of privilege, if that makes sense. Like, it's not because they're not like looked down upon, if that makes sense. Versus like in America, right? Black people are inherently looked down upon or like assumed to be less smart.
Yeah, yeah. This kind of relates to something we learned in biology. Not to get too scientific for people that not interested, but we learned about um, dominant and recessive genes. When you hear those terms, you think like, oh, the recessive genes means there's less of those genes in the pool in the population. Not necessarily. It just means that if there's a dominant allele available, then the phenotype or the physical features associated with that gene won't be expressed. So kind of like what you're saying with your mother, she may have been the minority, meaning there was less of her in number, but in terms of being a dominant figure or dominant quote unquote race in society, she definitely had that dominance, considering that she wasn't privileged according to your experience in the Bahamas.
Yeah.
But yeah, besides that, you mentioned being not only black but also being a woman in the STEM field. How do you feel like those two identities maybe not as regarded as much in your experience in chemistry?
I think there are a lot of challenges that women face in STEM, especially in chemistry. And I think um, the intersectionality of also being a black woman just adds an extra layer to it. Um, is your question just for me to like talk about that intersectionality? I'm sorry.
It's up to you. It's up to you. If you feel like that's a point you want to harp on, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think when I think about being a woman, there's a lot of things that are you face. It's a male dominated field. I'm an organic chemist. My lab is mostly men. My field is mostly men. There's no female organic chemistry professors in my department. Like, when we take our qualifying exam, so this big second year exam that we take basically to advance to what's called candidacy. But it's just like a test most PhD students take in their second year. During that test, like, if we want to have a woman in the room besides us, we have to find someone outside of our department, because we get assigned 3 people from in the department to be on our committee, and we get an option to choose who from outside the department is that fourth person, and that's our only opportunity to have a woman in the room with us. And I think because in a lot of ways STEM is very male dominated, and that is a challenge in itself, right? People don't think about this. We have floors in our department that only have men's restrooms. So women have to go to other floors of the department in order to use a restroom. Um, we have, it's harder for our voices to be heard, and it's harder for people to actually acknowledge what we're saying, right? Sometimes a woman will say something and then a man will say the exact same thing, and people will be like, oh yeah, that's a good point, when the man says it, and like ignore the woman said it at all. And like, these are experiences that we have like regularly in being in a chemistry lab. And I think on top of that, right, like the challenges faced by women, right, Black students also face a lot of challenges. And so for me, because I'm both Black and a woman, one thing is it's very isolating, right? I have great friends. Like I have such good friends in my department who are very understanding and like understand that I want to change them and they want to support me in that endeavor. And it's like good to be able to go to someone and say like this is what I'm facing. But the problem is that they don't really fully understand it, right? Because they're not in my position. Um, and I think a lot of times, like when we think about increasing or like improving diversity in STEM or like making it more equal or focusing on equity, a lot of people just focused on like getting men and women to be equal. For example, equal pay or, making sure their voices are heard equally and respected and that we are appointed leaders. But I think like what kind of frustrates me is that a lot of times in my lab, at least when we talk about equity or improving the climate, it's for just improving it for women and not for other underrepresented groups or not for the fact that Black women have different experiences. And it's hard because I'm the only one. So no one really quite understands where I'm coming from, if that makes sense.
Mm. No, that makes sense. It seems like it can almost feel like a ceaseless fight where there's more battles as you close one door, another door opens that you have to walk through to get to the next door. I was just thinking right now how back at Chapel Hill you're part of um, a cohort called the Chancellor Science Scholars, and they would promote you on their flyers and you know advertisements to the upcoming classes. And I just found that hilarious, being you are a standout student in the chemistry department, but you're also a person of color. Do you get that similar treatment at Berkeley? I'm just curious right now.
So no, not exactly the same. I think, so Chancellor Science Scholars at UNC is this program that was modeled off of a program in Maryland called the Meyerhoff Scholars. And Berkeley recently started a similar program. They're called the Seed Scholars. And like as soon as I got to Berkeley, I got involved and they hadn't even started. And the first thing they did was interview me. And if you go to their website, there's an interview about my journey, like to where I got to be. So, when I first got to Berkeley, I was like, wow, the same thing is happening that happened at UNC where like CSS used me on all their flyers. Um, but I don't think that that's still the case. I think, um, it's not that Berkeley doesn't take advantage of photo ops and opportunities to promote photos, right? But the problem is that I don't necessarily go to all of those events where they would find those photos. I did once get chosen to be interviewed for a fundraising campaign where they made me like recite lines. Like they were like filming me in lab and they were like, say this, but then when you say this, include something about being a Black woman. Like they wanted me to like memorize lines, but then wanted to spice up a little bit to talk about my own experiences. And that was like the biggest time where I was like, they're trying to like promote that they have this Black woman in their department. But the interview didn't end up getting used. So, and they paid me. So it felt like, it wasn't just free. Um, so I will say, I think that it's not as I don't get promoted like I did at UNC, but I think that that's partially because I'm not at a lot of the events where maybe they would take that opportunity to take a photo op. Um, and I do think that anything the university does in that sense is performative anyway. So, like, at least CSS cared about me, right? When it was happening at UNC, the department cared about me a lot. Berkeley, it's not the same.
Yeah. Of course, that staged interview per se was not as virtuous as um, a virtuous example of promoting diversity or using your image to promote diversity. But think about other examples, even your time at CSS, with the photo ops being used in flyers to promote diversity? Do you feel like those are honest, a sign of integrity in the sense of trying to promote diversity and inclusion in the sciences, or would you, prefer that schools do it another way?
So it's the thing is I don't mind when CSS did it just because they would take photos for the most part that like the chemistry department would have decided to feature me and they did a photo shoot, and then CSS would take those same photos and use it for promotion. And even though I was embarrassed to be used for promotion, I didn't mind it because the only reason that I'm here I am today is because of the Chancellor Science Scholars. And so for me, that's why that particular experience, I didn't, even though I was embarrassed by it because I don't like, that attention. I knew they genuinely were the best thing that could have ever happened to me in terms of my chemistry career. They're the reason that I am where I am today. In general, though, the photo ops are not like just taking a photo of a Black student and putting it on your website just because they're there. And that actually has happened to me elsewhere. So Vanderbilt, I did a summer program at Vanderbilt when I was an undergrad, and they did a photo op for their new major. So like they were having a new major, and so they came into the lab and took photos of me and the other summer student. And one of those photos ended up on the med school's website. Like I don't think it's still there, but Vanderbilt's medical school is using a photo of me from my undergrad time to the summer research program, right? They just needed a photo of diversity. And like, that's what really annoys me. Like in general, where they just have this photo, it's now their property and they can use it forever, whatever they want. Like that is just performative. Like, let me show you, let me try to invite you into my space. That's probably not safe, but look, we have this Black student. And I don't even go to Vanderbilt. I was just there for a summer. Um, and so I think most of the time it's very performative and it's not like it doesn't do anything, right? And it's not even like they take the time to like highlight you or write an article about you. They just like put a picture and call it a day. So in general, I don't think it's a good idea. The reason I didn't mind it for CSS is because I could tell they truly cared about me. And even the chemistry department, if they decided to feature me initially because, oh, there's this Black woman, she's doing well in chemistry at at UNC, I I know I made the department rethink a lot of things. Like I had very honest conversations with the PI that I worked with at UNC, Alex Miller, to be like, this department is not supportive. And he would be like, oh, but we're like, have more Black students in chemistry. And I'm like, well, is it the BA or the Bachelor of Arts or the Bachelor in Science? Because I'm the only Black woman in my chemistry classes. And so I know I made them rethink a lot of things. And I know that they cared. I don't know if that answers your question, but my point is that I know it's mostly performative. It's just CSS. I knew they had good intentions.
Yeah. No, I just recently met a black lady student who's going to Vanderbilt for med school. So it'll be interesting to see if, they're going to use her to replace you soon, if you're still up there on the website. Hopefully she's ready for that. But it seems like as long as they have your student code, you're registered in their system, they have your rights, as long as you did not decline, for any photos to be used.
Yep.
But yeah, it's interesting that you're saying, a lot of these attempts to promote diversity seem to be performative. I'm trying to think, you've probably given this more thought than I have. What can be done, to make it less performative and actually make it more effective and institutionalized?
I think more focus needs to be made on the current. So what I observe is that most of the time when people their DE&I efforts are for recruiting. So they try to recruit more underrepresented minorities to their program. And those things are like, for example, for grad school, I got a lot of fee waivers because I had attended a minority conference or because I was in CSS. Like, they, there was a lot of efforts to try to get me to come to these institutions. I got thrown extra money at me. So like recruiting efforts is where people focus most of their effort, like attention. But my problem is that they're not fixing the program or fixing the culture. I think it's unfair to recruit underrepresented students to your program if your program is not welcoming and your program and you're not providing them any support to stay there, right? I think more, and the problem is the reason I think people focus on recruiting is because they can say we have 5 Black people in our department or we have this many trans students. Like if you, that's like data that they can report outwardly. So to say I'm doing something, and a lot of times, right, that's what people care about. It's like looking good on paper. I think more effort needs to be focused on improving the culture within your department. Our department, for example, does these like uh, climate surveys every year where they survey the department to see how we're doing. Do you feel included? And all that stuff. And literally last year when I filled out the survey, I didn't even answer it honestly because the survey asks you what division you're in. So I had to say I was in synthesis. And they asked you, were you a man or man, woman, non-binary? Like they asked you your gender. And it asked me my race. So if I answer all 3 of those questions, you would know, like, it's me. I'm the only Black woman in synthesis. And so therefore anything I answered would not be even kept, like you could exactly figure out who it traced back to. And so this year they improved the survey. They like aggregated multiple minority races together to try to like decrease the ability to figure out who was writing those honest things. But my thing with those surveys is then that they just report out the results and we have a discussion, but there hasn't been real change, right? They still don't want to pay us enough. They don't require PIs to do trainings. I think professors should be required to learn how to deal with underrepresented students before they bring them in for the summer or before they have them in their lab. I think that they should be doing anti-bullying trainings. I think that those D.E.I trainings should be required in order to be a professor, but that's not what they care about, right? They only care about research. And I understand I'm rambling, so I'm really sorry, but my point is just like trainings would be a great start. Having, you know, the opportunity, like, to give feedback where the feedback is not going to be, there's no retaliation. My department in particular needs to improve, like, our committee situation, right? Like, we're basically stuck with our professor and there's no opportunity to like get to know other faculty in the department. And so if you're struggling with your PI, there's no one to go to. And I think underrepresented students are the ones that struggle more because, they don't want to face that backlash. And so I guess my point is we really need to focus on the people who are already in your department and making real change. I remember I interviewed at one school where there was actually several women faculty. You could tell that they had different initiatives going on, different organizations, different like things built into the curriculum to actually show that they're making efforts. And so I think focus on that rather than focusing on recruiting. Focus less on what you can write down on paper that you're doing to show the world that you're inclusive and actually do things that make real change that are not just on paper.
So does culture change come with also changing the composition of the staff and faculty?
Yes. So you still need to recruit, and it's hard, right? Because you do need to like have more underrepresented people, more diverse faculty. You need people who can like shake up the culture. But the problem is that if you're not given the opportunity to do so, or if you come in and you're a Black woman faculty but you can't make any changes because if you don't, right, think about it, if they don't do X, Y, and Z, they won't get tenure. They'll be forced to leave the university. And so it's hard to shake things up because of that fear of tenure. And it shouldn't really be on those minority faculty. right, to make those big changes. And so that's why I think it really needs to come from within. Those people who have tenure, those white men who just sit on professors who just do whatever they want, um, and not care about these things. We need change from within.
Sorry. So you were saying that I'm gonna let you repeat yourself, and then we'll continue. Apologize.
I was in order. Here's the thing. Yes, we need to make the staff more diverse. We need to, like, recruiting is part of it, but my problem is you can't do that recruitment without changing yourself within first. Because, like, let's say you recruit a Black woman to be a professor at a university, but then they can't make any real change because they're trying to get tenure. They need to do X, Y, and Z to get tenure. They need to stay on people's good sides. And so they must fit the mold. They don't have that opportunity to shake things up. Or if they take the risk to try and shake things up, they might not get tenure and might be out of a job in 5 years. And so I think what's really important is the people who are already on the staff, the people who have tenure, those old white men who just sit and, and just focus on chemistry, for example, those people need to be trained. They need to be the ones trying to change the department, because it's unfair to try to recruit people. The work should not be put on the underrepresented students. The work should be put on the people with privilege. Obviously, they should seek paid, they should get advice from people who are trained in that. That's the other thing. Just because I'm a Black woman does not mean I'm trained in diversity, equity, inclusion, right? I have my own experiences. I have my own perspectives, and that obviously shapes how I see chemistry and what changes need to be made. But that doesn't mean I'm an expert, right? And I don't know how to necessarily fix the department. But there are people out there who are, so they should be asking those people. My point is that culture needs to be changed from the people who have the power to do so, and then you can recruit those unrepresented minority faculty, staff, students, and that will continue to improve the climate of department.
Okay, I see. So start has to start with the people who have the privilege, the power, and then trickle down into the recruiting of the staff, and then also ultimately changing the culture for the students and underrepresented folk that are coming in. Now I'm gonna ask you a question that's a little bit tricky, a little bit maybe controversial, but I think I like to play a little bit devil's advocate, just to give the other side a little bit of, I guess, say in the conversation. Some may say, the culture within, maybe there's not a lot of Black people pursuing STEM. Maybe there's not a lot of Black people pursuing, um, you know, becoming a Ph.D. or becoming a professor or being professionals in higher education to help ultimately change the culture. You know, does there need to be a change within, Black community or communities of color in terms of promoting STEM as a career field?
What I'll say is that there is not lack of interest. If you look, there are lots of studies that show that when people enter college, there's pretty much like an equal amount of, based on the percentage of Black students that make up the school, for example, that want to pursue STEM degrees. But during those first few years, they're pushed out, right? It's the leaky pipeline. So my thing is like, there's not a lack of interest or desire to pursue STEM, right? There might not be people who know, like, I didn't know what a PhD was when I came to Carolina. I didn't know my parents didn't know what a PhD was. So yeah, part of it is like, you may not know those opportunities exist, but the reality is that Black students come in wanting to pursue STEM, and they're beaten down in those intro weed out classes, or they get to grad school, and during grad school their experience is so bad that they don't want to stay in STEM. And so I think that that's why people need to focus on retention, right? because these people do not feel like they belong. Um, Black students don't feel like they belong, and then they decide to switch majors and they leave STEM. Um, and so I think that needs to be the focus, retention, which once again comes from changing the culture and making these people feel more included, um, rather than, oh, more black people need to pursue it. Like, they want to, they just don't feel included. I hope that answers your question.
No, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a way to, I guess, rebuttal the other side of the argument. You know, there is interest, but is the interest being, procured? Is it well groomed to the point where it can actually fulfill that interest?
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're, at a point where can wrap up the conversation. I think this is pretty insightful from you, Kristen. I'm learning a lot more about you and your experiences. I know this stuff we talked about here and there, but it's good to see you bring some examples and maybe some solutions to light for what you feel like is going to be your future battle, your everyday and future battle as a Black woman pursuing chemistry in a PhD program. Is there anything else you wanted to add? I know you got a Ghanaian who's you work closely with too. I don't know if you want to shout him out or you have any words for him. I'm not trying to get you into trouble or anything, but this opportunity for you to do that.
Um, yeah, I work for a amazing Black PI who was born and raised in Ghana, Dr. Richmond Sarpong. If you want to learn more about him, he has lots of TED Talks talking about how he got to his career. But yeah, that's definitely working for a Black PI and having that representation is important. I think, that's a big reason why I chose Berkeley and I chose like his group was so that I would have a Black PI. But yeah, it's been really great to be here today and talk to you a little bit about my experiences. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, for sure. And let him know, especially if he gets the chance to listen to this. I gotta have a meeting with you.
Okay.
But yes, without further ado, wrap things up here. This is Kojo, and lovely lady on the screen is,
Kristen.
and this is the Friend Zone. We're out.